This is the ultimate guide that you need to be very well equipped when it comes to cinematography and film production as a whole. It's taken me a lot of time to summarize and make it so simple for you to understand within the shortest period of time. And now we are going to jump right into it without wasting your time. Well, cinematography is simply everything that is involved in terms of filmmaking. That is lighting, it's about sound, it's about the resolution of the videos, the filming itself, And in that particular cinematography, you focus on two things. We have exposure and composition. So composition is just the arrangement of those elements that you would like to see in that photograph or video that you're creating. And on the other hand, exposure is the lighting in relation to those particular subjects that you're filming or taking pictures of. So if you understand these two concepts, you'll be able to use any camera that you have. The basic things that you use to the most expensive equipment that you'll be able to use in the future. So if you get that concept right, just right from the go, then you don't have any issues when it comes to using and handling other equipment. So exposure and composition is essential when it comes to film making, cinematography as a whole. What you need to look at is that composition is a rule of exclusion. So any element that is unnecessary in that particular film or photograph that you're taking, you have to get rid of it totally. People do not need to see it. The audience are not interested in seeing that thing that is not important in communicating the message, because it's an art. Media and content creation and filmmaking is an art. It's an art of communication. So if you cannot really communicate well by having some distraction in the picture or video that you're filming, then you're really doing a disservice to your audience. This can be done by either moving closer to your subject. If, for example, you're having prime lenses as the type of lens that you have to move closer to your subject so that you can get rid of unnecessary spaces, unnecessary elements that are not important in that film. Or you can use something called using longer focal length lenses. So lenses that you can be able to zoom in to your subject closer. So if you're not using a prime lens, you have these other zoom lenses. You can be able to zoom into that particular subject that you want. Another thing is that use of depth of field. Use of depth of field is an element that depends on another thing that we're going to talk about in a few seconds, which is aperture. So it will be able to blur the background or the foreground depending on what you want to hide, so that it is not in focus. You only focus on the things that you want. Like, for example, you're seeing me here, my face is very in sharp focus, but the background behind me is out of focus. So I'm hiding the elements that are on that particular screen. So that is very, very important, use of depth of field. Another thing is using shadows to hide unwanted elements in the frame that you're doing. How you use the rule of thirds determines how professional you are. When you communicate using the camera, you have to always apply the rule of thirds, because the rule of thirds is also borrowed from the natural communication settings. You have to divide equally your frame into 3 horizontal and vertical lines, and then put your subject in either of the 4 points of intersection. So the subject has to be there, and then there will be something called the looking room, whereby we can be able to refer to the environment that this particular person is, this particular subject is set in. The setting is very important. It sets the mood of that particular film or photograph that you have taken. You have to move the subject either to the sides, to either of the corners. So for example, you're filming an interview. You have to use, the interviewer will be on one side and the interviewee will be on the other side. If you're using you're filming something called a testimonial, for example, it's a press conference, the subject cannot be in the middle. You have to, slide a little bit to position them in that particular intersection so that you can be able to communicate. It is so natural. It's very cinematic. It's very professional. If you do that just like that, it looks very unprofessionally done. Another thing is that you have to do something called finding leading lines. So for example, the horizon, it's a leading line. Another thing can be the bridge, for example. Another thing can be the landscape that you're using. For example, you're filming in the city. So finding leading lines is very important, because it will help your viewers to be guided on how the actions that the subject in that particular cinematic film or photograph that you're taking is actually, it communicates the environment, it communicates the settings, it does a lot other than just not following the leading line. When you see these two images that we have here, they are the same, right? But one is overexposed and the other one is underexposed. So you always have to find the middle ground whereby you expose your images or your videos correctly so that we do not miss out some of the details in the creation that you've taken. So here we are missing out the clouds, here we are missing out the grass and the ground. So it's very important for you to understand exposure so that you can find the middle ground that you'll be able to be guided into. And the way you do that is by doing something called understanding what aperture is. One of the role of apertures is that apertures help you to get that bokeh feel, that background that is completely out of focus. And the lower the number of that aperture, the wider that aperture is going to be open. So when you look at your lens, that particular inlet that allows light to go through to that sensor of that camera is what we call aperture, and it usually goes up, it widens or contracts to, so when you increase the number, it increases the aperture unit. So when you decrease the number, it increases the size of that aperture so that it will allow more light. And then when it is doing that, we have something called shallow focus and another thing called deep focus. So when it is shallow focus is when you have like an f2.8 as the f-stop that you're using on that particular lens of yours. This is measured in f-stop. So anytime you see, even on your phone, there is something called f, and then that number that follows, that is what we call aperture. In other cameras, they call it iris, because I think they borrowed from that iris in my eye. But it's important to understand that the lower the number, and even the lower the number, the most expensive that particular lens is, especially if it's a prime lens, or a zoom lens for that particular matter, like a 600mm with f1.4 is a very expensive lens. So, and then the higher the number of f-stops, the smaller the aperture. So it will be able to put your image into sharp focus. So that is exposing elements in terms of clarity, and exposing elements in terms of defocus. So that is aperture, and the role of aperture is very essential. If you invest in good lenses, you'll be able to achieve this kind of quality that you always look into. The other thing is called shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration of time. It's measured into seconds. So it's the duration of time that particular light will go through that aperture, through that shutter lock to the sensor. So the exposure duration of the light in the sensor is what we call shutter speed. So for example, if the lower the number, meaning that the faster the shutter speed, the sharper the content. So for example, here at a 500th second is very sharp, but within half a second, it's actually a little bit blur. So this is half a second. This is a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second. This is a 15th second. Yeah. So it's measured in that particular duration. And this doesn't mean that you will be able to film very bad things. Actually, shutter speed is used creatively to do something called long exposure. And if you go online and just Google long exposure, you will see how nice photography and creativity has been applied just by using shutter speed alone. Another thing is what we call ISO, and ISO is the sensitivity of light on the sensor. These do not mess up with, because if you get higher ISOs, then you're going to get grainy shots on the particular content you're filming. For example, at ISO 25,000, it is grainy. You will see, like, there's a time we used to have TVs called Great Wall, and when it misses signal, you will see black and white grains. So those kind of things will be on your shot. But this time will be not black and white, it will be colored. But it's very bad. If you shoot with high ISO, it's not a good thing. Usually, normal ISO, when you're doing outside, we put it at 100, and I personally do not go beyond 1600, because if I go beyond 1600, it means I'm in a low light condition. So what do I need? I need to add external lights. I need to get lights and put in that particular scene so that I can be able to film my subject in the best, most appropriate manner. So these three principles have been summarized here, as you can see. When you understand exposure, we've already moved away from composition. Composition is something else, where you have the rule of thirds, you have the lenses that you're using, you have to move closer to the subject if you're having a prime lens, or you have to use a long focal length so that you can be able to zoom in to that particular subject. Or you have to use something called shadows to hide that person, or you have to use depth of field to hide the subject that the elements that are unnecessary, like background, so that they'll be totally out of focus. And that is an essential when it comes to the particular lens that you have, especially the lenses that have a lower number of f-stops or aperture. And exposure is where we talk about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So depending on the environment that you are in, you can pick any number here. For example, 32, it is very sharp. It means everything will be exposed. Sharp focus, it's just landscape, automatic focus. Everything is going to be in focus. But when you go to f1.4 as the aperture, then the subject will be sharp focus and the background will be out of focus. On the other hand, if you go to shutter speed, the faster the shutter speed, the sharper the image, sharper the video, sharper the subject. The slower the shutter speed, the more blurry that particular content. Is it blurry? Hazy, it's not, it's like it's showing that motion, like it doesn't show static image. It doesn't show the, is it blurry? But there is just something that is not going to look good. Not unless you're intending to do that by doing something called long exposure, which is a creative kind of thing on my side. Another thing is called ISO. ISO is essential, but you do not have to pass specific margins. For example, my maximum is 1600, and the normal one that I use for my lens, for my camera, it's 100. I don't go automatic because automatic sometimes it messes up with everything. Then I can play with these two, which is shutter speed and aperture. So shutter speed, another thing that you need to understand is that if you're filming, shutter speed is 2 times your frames per second. So for example, you're filming at 30 frames per second. So your shutter speed should be not below 60, right? So a 60th of a second is the one that should be shutter speed. So for example, you're filming at 24 frames per second. So you do 24 times 2, which is 48. So you round it off to next, to be 50. Or 25 frames per second, which will be 50. So if you're filming at the other units, you have to just take the frames per second times 2, and then you'll be at that particular number of shutter speed that you'd like to get. Because if you don't do that, then you'll be having something that we call drop frames, frame drops. So when you, for example, film at 24 frames per second and your shutter speed is at 30, f30, at 30th second, then you're going to have some frames are going to be dropping. When you put that video on the timeline, you'll be missing some frames. So with that, I believe that you've already learned something that I've summarized for you from the beginning: composition, exposure. And exposure, you have to look at these things: shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Those are the 3 things that you always have to look into. I said aperture is on some cameras, on other cameras it's called iris. And then when you look at ISO, is ISO, and other cameras is called gain. So yeah, I believe you learned something new today. I hope to see you in the next video, and also comment to me whether you learned anything in this and what you'd like us to focus on in the next episode. Thank you.